Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Ambassador Princeton Lyman, who is the former U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria and to South Africa. He was Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations in the Clinton administration. Princeton Lyman is currently Director of the Global Interdependence Initiative at the Aspen Institute, a project coordinating the efforts of advocacy, business, and humanitarian groups to cope with the tensions created by contemporary globalization. Ambassador Lyman, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kreisler.
Where were you born and raised?
Born right here in San Francisco, California. I went to school here, went to George Washington High School, and then went to Berkeley.
And we'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
How, in retrospect, do you think your parents shaped your character, looking back?
Well, my parents were both immigrants from Lithuania, ran a small grocery store in San Francisco, and I grew up very early during World War II, and they were preoccupied with world events, and they talked about them all the time. My father read all the newspapers. Then there were 4 daily newspapers in San Francisco, and read them all from end to end. We listened to all the commentators on the radio, so I think I absorbed a great deal of interest in world affairs.
Were there a lot of books around the house, a lot of reading?
Yes. My mother had a very nice library, a lot of literature, more literature background than contemporary.
Mm-hmm. And any books from your childhood that stand out, either as a very young person learning to read, or later, in high school?
Oh, gee. I tell you, in high school, because it's important, had a wonderful teacher, an English teacher, who, Edith Guerin, who taught us not only how to read and write well, but told us that we should always subscribe to magazines like the Atlantic Monthly or Harper's, and I've done that all my life, as well as many others, but it was a very, very important influence in high school.
And any other mentors besides her that strike you?
Well, of course, later on in my career, there were very important mentors. But here at Berkeley, Eric Belquist was very important because I was already interested in going into foreign affairs, and he taught the course on U.S. foreign policy, had served in the State Department. And then Victor Jones, who ran the first honors program that we were in. So there were a number of people here who were very influential.
What years were you at Cal?
I graduated in 1957.
1957. And so you didn't make much of a trip to come to college then?
No, although we lived over here.
And what sort of courses besides political science? Or were you only, by that time, really committed to doing
a lot of political science, but I took sociology. Professor Shibatani was here then, sociology, and I took history courses, and I had a minor in French, a lot of French literature courses. I really did like literature courses.
When in this period that we're talking about, did you decide that, A, you wanted to do political science, and then you actually go on to graduate school at Harvard after Berkeley? So was there a kind of a choice here between being an academic and going into government?
It was a choice. I knew I wanted to go into government service, but I also thought I wanted to combine it with academic work. So when I graduated from Berkeley, I went to Harvard to get a PhD. Went to the government thinking I would stay there 5-6 years, and I stayed 37. So, but always tried to have a hand in academia. I used to teach at night at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. But the government career was very satisfying, and I have no regrets.
And who did you work under at Harvard?
Well, initially Rupert Emerson, because I was looking at U.S. policy in Southeast Asia. And then I did my dissertation under William Yandell Elliott. But Carl Friedrich was teaching theory, and that was very, very, very influential.
And how do you compare Berkeley and Harvard? And I'm not trying to trap you here.
That's hard to say. It's hard because you're comparing undergraduate and graduate work. But I felt I was very fortunate because I was in an honors program my senior year here at Berkeley in political science, and I think that really did prepare me an awful lot for graduate work at Harvard. It was very intense. There's a very intense intellectual atmosphere at Harvard, and you feel a bit of competitiveness. But I was fortunate also in that my dissertation advisor said, look, I know you want to go into government, don't spend your life writing your dissertation. Move it along and go on with your life. And that was good advice.
And what years were you at Harvard?
57 to 61.
To 61.
So I went to Washington when John F. Kennedy became president.
And what was your first job there? Did you go into the civil service or the foreign service?
I joined the foreign aid program because I wanted to work on Asia, and they offered me a position in the Far East Bureau, and I started in the civil service and then switched to the foreign service.
Mm-hmm. And so what was it like being in government service during this period, which actually becomes the Vietnam War, and all that followed from that?
Well, it's a very good question, because when I came into the foreign aid program, it was just being reorganized and with great emphasis on growth and development. But then things got taken over very much by the Vietnamese War, and I ended up in that period being the liaison with the Pentagon on counterinsurgency programs and what the foreign aid program would contribute to that, et cetera. And didn't really get out of that until I went to Korea rather than going to Vietnam.
Is there a deja vu quality about today's events? That is the notion that subjects like aid may become secondary to our fight on terror?
Well, I think this is a principal issue that we have to be concerned about, and I know, because I know the psychology of the department and the government, that right now all our diplomatic efforts are being turned to getting cooperation on terrorism. That's understood, but the question is, where do all the other issues get fit into the priorities? Now, I think it's still to be determined how that balance is put forward, and frankly, it takes more vision than I think we've put forward so far.
What is it about doing diplomacy? Talk a little about that. That came later in your career, but I'm just curious as to what you see as the skills required to be a successful diplomat.
I think there's several skills. One is listening carefully, trying to understand where people are coming from, even people you disagree with. And then being able to articulate a point of view and to find where you can common ground. I think the most definitive experience for me was my assignment as ambassador to South Africa, which was during the transition from apartheid to democracy and Nelson Mandela's election. And we really tried not only to bring people together, but to reach out even to some of the more extreme groups and help bring them in and bring to bear what America had to offer. It also requires articulating to Washington what's going on overseas and why it's going on. So I think it's a variety of skills, and actually the background in political science was very helpful.
And what about you, because you were also a civil servant when you were an aide? I mean, in other words, what did you get out of that experience, and what were the skills that were required there? I mean, is it more analytic and less listening, or did you have to do that? Did you have to be a diplomat within the government?
Oh, you have to be a diplomat within the government, and I spent a somewhat extended part of my career in Washington as opposed to some of the others in the Foreign Service. A great deal of it is interagency cooperation, and I ended up doing that for much of my career. When I started in the Foreign Aid Program at the Far East Bureau, I became the liaison with the Pentagon, between AID and the Pentagon, on this whole range of counterinsurgency programs. When I went to Korea, I was the liaison for the aid mission with the embassy and the U.S. military. And getting cooperation, bringing agencies together, finding ways to work together, overcoming problems is a major preoccupation in Washington.
So that work, in a way, could be said to have helped prepare you.
Oh yes, I mean, it's some people don't like it in Washington for just that reason, but no, it's part of what you have to do, and there were times when you use those skills, and I certainly tried to bring agencies together around policies that we felt were very important, like economic development in Africa, debt relief, drought relief, emergency relief, where you had to bring a lot of agencies together and solve a lot of problems. And that's really the way you get things done in Washington.
Now, you mentioned in passing before that your education in political science had helped you. In what ways did it help, and in what ways did it get it wrong? That is, the theory different from the practice?
Well, it helped because I was kind of an interloper. I was a political scientist in an economic development agency. It was an advantage because at that time people were interested in interdisciplinary approaches, gradually the political aspects of development, et cetera, and having a political science background was a particular advantage. But you know, you don't do a lot of theory when you're in government. You do a lot of practical program development. And there were some people in government who didn't like PhDs, who felt that PhDs were not good government officials because they couldn't be operational enough. So there was a little tension like that, but not a lot.
Were there a lot of frustrations in that early period because of your comparative background? You had studied at Harvard, you had studied under Rupert Emerson. Were you torn about some of the things that we were undertaking based on the knowledge you had acquired as a political scientist?
Well, like a lot of people, I got very disillusioned with our policy in Southeast Asia. I had done my dissertation on U.S. policy in Southeast Asia. I'd done a lot of work on it in Washington. I was originally scheduled to go to Vietnam for other reasons. It was delayed, and when the time came that I could have gone to Vietnam, I chose not to do so. I did make some visits out there for the agency, but I had become very disillusioned with American policy, and people knew that. I even organized an anti-Vietnam rally in the State Department, which almost cost me my career. So people said, well, they know Princeton's not the kind of person we want to send to Vietnam. So that was difficult. That was a difficult period.
What are your thoughts, since you just said you led a protest? I guess that must be because you went to Berkeley, but we won't assume that. What are your thoughts about the learning curve of the government and the way things began to turn around? What was it about that experience that sticks in your mind and informs the work you do now, how we change our thinking about particular problems?
Well, I think one of the things that was very clear in the Vietnam situation was that we were not telling the truth to ourselves. And that we had convinced ourselves we could do things that we weren't able to do. And the sad thing that I found about it was that there were very, very good people out there throwing their hearts into this who were deeply, deeply committed to it. And you could see that what they were doing was not going to succeed because the whole framework was wrong. And I think the biggest thing to learn is the honesty that you need, and you need dissenting voices, even though they're an irritant often. You have to listen to them. I think that it helped later, as we talked about, and there's been so much written since then on conflict resolution, that we understand a little bit more than we did then about what motivates people in conflict, and you don't solve the problem the way we tried to solve it there.
If you were to be asked how and this is something that I ask a lot of my guests, how the 60s affected you, what's the bottom line there?
Well, I think the 60s I felt a lot of pressure. I used to talk to a lot of people who would be demonstrating outside the State Department, and they would say, why are you there? And I'd say, because I felt it was very important that people be thinking about these things inside as well as outside. And there were a number of people inside the government who were raising a lot of questions, et cetera. And I felt that was important. But I think the 60s, made all of us think very hard about what we were doing, what our role was, where you draw the line on your ethics, and where you're prepared to. I did never believe in sabotaging policies. I didn't believe that that was the right thing to do, but I did believe that if you really felt you were doing something wrong, you should ask to be relieved of that responsibility. I never had to face that, but I did feel you had to ask yourself those questions.
Before we talk about today's world before 9/11 and after 9/11, I feel compelled to ask you, you have worked on the inside and you've thought a lot about that experience, and now in many ways you're an outsider thinking about how to change things. What's the difference in those two roles, and what do you bring to being an outsider because of your experience as an insider?
One of the things is when you're an insider, you are under so much pressure on day-to-day operational matters that it's very hard to step back. You don't do much reading outside of the daily stack of things that are on your desk every morning to read. So your ability to step back and be a little bit distant and philosophical is very difficult. You're under a lot of pressure to get through the day, get meetings done, get various programs through. And when you're outside, you have a little more freedom to go to a seminar, to read some more papers, to think. And that's why it's extremely valuable for people in the government to get out every once in a while, to have a sabbatical, to step back. But I also think, in the government there's tremendous opportunities. You have a chance to put ideas forward to people who are going to make a difference, who are making decisions. You can't often do that from outside. You really are outside. And inside, you can use either your bureaucratic influence, if you have some, or your resources. I mean, one of the advantages of the AID program is you have money. So you could put money behind ideas, and we did that a lot.
Let's talk a little about U.S. foreign policy, because you have a long experience. What is distinctive about the way we conduct foreign policy, would you say?
Well, I think there are two things that make us a bit distinctive. One is we do think of ourselves as rather exceptional. And in some ways that's good, because we think as a nation that we bring certain values to foreign policy. And the work I do at Aspen shows that the public thinks that way too. The second thing is that being now the only superpower, but even before a major power, has a major impact on how you carry out diplomacy and how you carry out foreign policy. On the one hand, there are no initiatives that go on that people don't want the United States involved because they feel if the U.S. is involved, it'll work. On the other hand, when we get involved, there is a tendency to feel that it's got to be done pretty much our way. And I think those are two things that make the U.S. a bit distinctive in foreign policy.
And where do you think this having our own way comes from? Is it out of our cultural history, or is it because of the power that we have in the world?
I think it's partly the power we have in the world. I think it's, and this is one of the things that I'm struck by in American policy. You have a feeling when you're negotiating for the United States that you're expected to bring back something that will not only be a good solution, but will pass muster with critics in Congress. So that if you, especially when you're working in multilateral affairs, that you come back with something that can withstand criticism from the Hill. And that becomes a very important preoccupation for the administration in the last 10, 12 years.
And that democratic feature has been both a plus and a minus at different times in our history, because it's been important to contributing to change when change is needed, but on the other hand, it really becomes an obstacle when we see a problem and we think we know what to do about it.
It can be both, and I've seen it work both ways. I've seen very important congressional initiatives and questioning that have had a major bearing on policy, and support for things that the administration might not have done. Very strong support from the Congress on a range of humanitarian activities and refugee activities that I was involved with. It was extremely important. On the other hand, when the power in the Congress is in the hands of people who are very negative on cooperation, and the rest of the Congress is not prepared to challenge them, then you're in a different situation. And when I was Assistant Secretary, struggling to get our arrears paid to the UN, The conservatives, who were very critical of the UN, were in the driver's seat, and the people who would have been supporters chose at that time not to be active. And that put us in a very, very difficult position, because what we were up against was policies that were not necessarily reflective either of the country or the Congress, but were reflective of the people who were running those committees.
Now, is this a failure of our political process, the way we're electing people, who gets into office? Is it a product of the media-driven politics, the way ideas are put out there by niche channels that have a very conservative view? What's up here? Because this is obviously very different from the period, earlier periods where we were so committed to multilateral organizations like the UN.
I think two things happened. One, after the Cold War, politically, it would seem more attractive to people in the Congress to be focused on domestic affairs. So that if you look at the early 90s, right after the 94 election, every subcommittee in the Senate was headed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was headed by a freshman senator. Now, that tells you something about what's important and what's not to senior senators. That's shifting now. Mm-hmm. But the other is the feeling that the public wasn't interested. And what we have found in the project I'm working on at the Aspen Institute is that that wasn't true. Mm-hmm. That the public was interested, felt the U.S. should be heavily engaged, but for a variety of reasons, the public wasn't brought into these issues very much, and therefore they didn't become politically salient. And the media reinforced that feeling, so that I couldn't get support on the Hill, to be perfectly candid, for support for the United Nations during that early 90s period from people who I knew agreed with me, said they agreed with me, but said they weren't going to take the political risk of doing it.
So what becomes your problem then, or how do you do your job as Assistant Secretary, when on the one hand we can assume you know the importance of an organization like the UN, but on the other hand you have to be so guarded in the way you present the issues, because you really have a defensive strategy as opposed to an offensive one, which may be what the country needs, namely educating people about why the UN is important.
Well, we did two things. I mean, one, we made it was a policy of Madeleine Albright and the Clinton administration to try and find common ground with Jesse Helms and the other critics so that we could get out of this situation of the arrears. And the compromise we made, which took years of negotiation, was that we would press for certain reforms in the UN, some of which were quite needed, as a condition for our paying our arrears. And we assembled the political coalition necessary in the Congress to do that. And then finally we got allies from people who saw the advantages of that. But the public pressure was also important. Someone on Helms' staff told me later, when I asked her why Helms stuck with it after the thing dragged on so long, she said, frankly, we did get tired of being called a deadbeat nation. Mm-hmm. So public pressure also helped. And I did a lot of public speaking about the issues, et cetera, which was important at the same time we were negotiating. But I also had to stay very closely in touch with the United Nations to make sure that whatever conditions we negotiated with the Congress were really doable, because the worst thing would have been conditions that couldn't be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. So in the course of this job and this experience, you really got a sense of the problem with public opinion, and that they were not really what they thought we thought they were. Now, how is that? Tell us a little about the current project that you're directing and how that understanding is informing your current work.
Well, the presumption, and even was the presumption at the beginning of this project at the Aspen Institute, the Global Independence Initiative, was that the public wasn't very interested and we should mobilize more public attention. What we found through a great deal of research was that the public does feel that the U.S. should be engaged, but that the dialogue between the policy elite and the public was on different grounds. The policy elite, and that includes think tanks, media, pundits, Washington policymakers, is in terms of national interest, security, balance of power, etc. Whereas the general public tends to look at these issues largely from a values point of view. What's the right role for the United States? What's our share? No more, no less. What's the right thing to do in those circumstances? But the world, we found that the way it's presented from the media kind of makes the world so chaotic that the public doesn't really see where the accountability is, so they feel left out. And so policymakers take their view of the public from the media, and the media pretends to reflect the public, and it doesn't always do so. So what our project is designed to do is to engage the public more effectively in the dialogue and have that public view effective more in the whole policymaking process.
What you seem to be saying is that there is a problem with the linkages,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
That in other words, the elites in Washington, the people who matter there, are talking in terms that don't resonate with the people.
Exactly.
And that there isn't any kind of intermediary to do the translation or the work of translation.
That's right. And even the advocacy organizations are not always good at this. And one of the first things we did in our project after we did the research was to work with a lot of advocacy organizations on their own communications with the public, to take account of what the public really was interested in these issues. But now the question is to, as you say, to get intermediaries between the way the policy elite talks about it and the way the public. It was very interesting. I just testified a couple of weeks ago before Senator Biden on HIV/AIDS, and he said the same thing. He said, you know, when I go home, people ask me questions and they talk very differently than we talk here at the hearing. And so there are some political leaders who understand and he wanted very much to take this issue home to his constituents. He said, I've got to learn to talk about it in ways that my constituents are talking about it. And that's what we're trying to work on.
And explain that a little further. How are the people at home talking about it? I mean, is it that they see a starving baby, you know, on the television screen, and then they can, you know, feel what's happening there? Or?
Well, that's one way, but the problem with that is that it makes foreign aid and cooperation charity rather than cooperation and partnership. And one of the things that we have been very candid with the advocacy organizations about is the way that they appeal for money. Because yes, Americans are generous and they will respond, but that doesn't give them a very positive feeling about other countries. It's like these countries never get off dependency. So we emphasize in our communications ideas of partnership. But the second thing is that Americans, for example, support the idea of foreign aid, but they don't think it works. And there are more stories about its failures than about its successes. So there has to be much more communication about the fact that some of these problems are really soluble, and there are ways to do it if they're supported, and that some programs do work. And so that has to be said.
But then isn't there a problem with our media culture in the sense of its critical stance?
Yes.
It's looking for the bad news as a day-to-day matter?
Sure. What's that news series, The Fleecing of America? I wouldn't mind that series if one day a week he talked about programs that worked, but he doesn't. It's always the programs that look bad. And sure, that's important, and then media has to play that role. But it distorts the sense of what's possible. I'll give you another example of the administration trying to bend to its sharpest critics and missing the public. The Agency for International Development, the foreign aid agency, used to have on its website, because it used this with its critics in Congress, that 75% of its funds were actually spent on Americans or American goods. Well, the impact on the public was we knew it didn't go to the people who deserved it. And I have to say that the current administrator of AID has taken that off the website because people do think that the foreign aid program doesn't reach the right people, and that's an important factor.
Now, has there also been, in this recent period, a failure of leadership in terms of articulating our national interests, articulating a need to provide aid or to provide funds to deal with AIDS abroad and so on. Have our leaders failed in that regard?
Well, I think that's absolutely. You cannot underestimate the importance of leadership and that communication with the public. And what worries me, frankly, about the current situation is that while the leadership has defined the terrorism problem and the war on terrorism, what is not being defined for the American public is what kind of a world we want instead, and what kind of a better world. And our research suggests that you would get a very fine response from the American people if one defined, in terms of values that Americans feel the country stands for, those aspects of a world other than the war on terrorism. And that is not being done. It's being done, here and there, the HIV/AIDS, yes, but in terms of how we approach problems of poverty and autocracy, et cetera, and what our vision is, what we're going to do, that is not being done. And it instead painting the world as this very dangerous place in which war is the predominant theme. And that, I do think, is a failure of leadership.
Let's talk a little about state power in an era of globalization. Let's put aside 9/11 and not talk about terrorism yet. We'll get to that in a minute. But how would you characterize today's international environment?
Well, there's no question that there are things that the states have to do differently to have the influence they want to have. If you're a small state and you want to break into the world economic system and the trading system, you have to give up certain kinds of autarky that and you put yourself subject to movements of international capital that you really can't control. I follow South African events very closely. The South Africans have made this commitment to move into the international trading system. But every time there's a crisis in an emerging country, they see capital flowing out of their stock market, even though it isn't South Africa that's in trouble. So you lose that kind of thing. What you have to do is find new ways of operating to advance your own interests. Even for the United States, because of the movement of people today and the tremendous problems of smuggling of people and illegal migration, we can't control those issues and all the international crime and drugs that go with it ourselves. So we have to find methods of cooperation and diplomacy and multilateral agreements that will strengthen our ability to take care of our own people. And you can't do it the same way because of these global problems.
And how do these changes affect the role of an ambassador, like you were in Nigeria and in South Africa? Well,
they affected us, and they continue to affect the department in several ways. One is that the issues are not the traditional issues. You're focused on your diplomatic relations with the country and fairly immediate problems, and yet you're supposed to be doing something about global warming. And how do you fit that into your priorities? And what do you know about global warming? And then you add drugs, and you add crime, and you add regional stability. And the question is, how do you pull all those together and prioritize them and obtain the skills? And the department doesn't have all the skills. So it puts much more of a premium on an ambassador or any part of the department to amalgamate different skills and different professional ones and create the hierarchy of relationships one needs. You'll find in the department today, for example, the Department of State, a fair amount of tension between the regional bureaus and the functional bureaus. The regional bureaus are the traditional powerhouses. That's relations with China, with Russia, et cetera. And then you have oceans, environment, and science. You have drugs. You have refugees. These are looking at world problems and knocking on the regional director's door and saying, look, you've got to go to the government and talk about these things. And that can be a healthy tension, but it's not one that's always fully resolved.
And what is it about these functional problems that's different? You suggested earlier that they require multilateral solutions. That's one thing. What else about them makes it especially difficult for an ambassador or a government to get a hold of?
Well, for one thing, they're often very highly technical. and complex. And your counterpart in the country may not have the science either. So you not only have to make sure you know what you're talking about, but make available expertise if that's necessary and bring it out to the country and make it available. And the second thing is that the solution isn't going to be even bilateral. You're going to be negotiating with that government on things you want them to do in a multilateral context. And that isn't always the way traditional diplomacy is focused. So it's both the technical aspects of it and the fact that you're negotiating bilaterally for multilateral solutions.
And AIDS would be a good example of this.
AIDS would be a very good example, because here is something that some governments don't want to deal with. Some, it's changed now, but I'd say 10 years ago, a lot of embassies didn't want to deal with. It's not a pleasant subject. It gets you into a very difficult set of areas. But it requires not only you're dealing with the government, but these are problems that affect peacekeeping operations, regional security, etc. And it's a good example of exactly this. But I would say environmental issues are even more so.
And give us an example of an environmental issue that you grappled with in Nigeria. I guess as ambassador, all of the environmental issues raised by the extracting of the oil come to mind.
Well, with all due respect, I frankly didn't focus enough on it when I was there, and it's a good example of how environment didn't loom large enough in our diplomacy when I was in Nigeria in the middle 80s, that we did pay as much attention to it as we should have. Specific spills or something, yes, and we brought in a lot of expertise around one particular problem. But as I look back on it, we should have been thinking about the whole environmental degradation question and the political implications of it in the Delta. We do today, but we didn't then, and it's a good example of how these more non-traditional issues are now recognized to be some of the most salient political issues.
If you're a diplomat, and a diplomat who was trained as a political science, are you handicapped in a way by the overemphasis on the state and state power to a certain degree? I'm a political scientist, so
Yeah.
it's a friendly question, yeah.
Well, you know, when you're in the government, of course, you're part of state power. You're always trying to maximize its effectiveness and usefulness. But I think that one thing that I came to appreciate, and partly because of the assignments I had, was the collaboration with the non-governmental sector. I was director of refugee programs for 3 years. We could not carry out our functions without an alliance with the non-governmental sector, both abroad and in settling refugees in the United States. The voluntary work of refugee resettlement in the United States is enormous and takes tremendous burdens off the government. And to some extent in the foreign aid program. I also find, and I think it's helpful, although sometimes frustrating and difficult when you're negotiating something like the International Criminal Court, the strong role of the NGOs is both helpful in some ways and sometimes gets in your way.
So in a way, what you're suggesting, or I think I'm hearing, is that in some ways civil society, international society is ahead on certain issues.
Yes.
But on the other hand, we never can do away with governments, I would go on to assert. And so this raises questions about global governance and how do we govern in a situation where what states can do alone, no matter how powerful, is not what could be done before.
Well, I think civil society is extremely important in putting issues on the agenda, making them salient, building public support around them, whether it's human rights or environment or other issues. But if you want governance, you've got to have states agree, in most cases, not always, but in most cases, to set up rules, regulations, and enforcement. So you end up back, and most of the NGOs do end up back knocking on the door of state governments or multilateral institutions, the World Bank, et cetera, saying, these are the rules you need to set up. There are some areas, however, in which governments are probably not going to be the only actors. And we have these corporate NGO partnerships taking place to try and govern commerce through that, and environmentally sound commerce, etc. But in the end, whether it's a multilateral institution or other, it's the states that set the rules and create the enforcement mechanisms.
Now, we're not setting a good example, the United States these days, in terms of our attitude toward multilateral negotiations, multilateral agreements, and multilateral institutions. Comment on that, and what are the kinds of things that we can do to change that course? Because it seems from what you're suggesting, it's not going to work.
Well, you know, there's a new book out by John Eikenberry that points out that by emphasizing a tremendous development of multilateral institutions at the end of World War II, the United States foreign policy and its own foreign policy interests were extremely well served, and that we we don't now appreciate how valuable multilateral diplomacy was for our own national interests. What's not appreciated, I think, very much today is that same thing. That is, you multiply your influence and ability to deal with these issues. Doesn't mean you accept every agreement, et cetera. You don't bargain hard, et cetera. But if you look at some of the people who have been writing on behalf of this administration, and Charles Krauthammer is perhaps the most articulate, if it's the most extreme, is that multilateralism as a principle is wrong. Mm-hmm. That unilateralism is the way to go in the 21st century because we've got the power and we can do it. I had a congressman say that to me. Mm-hmm. He said, I'll tell you what others of us won't tell you, that we're the biggest superpower and the rest of the world should do what we say. It won't work. We can't even do it on terrorism, but certainly can't do it on crime and environment or drugs. So what's missing now is an appreciation of multilateralism as an important tool of diplomacy. And if you don't have that, then sure, you make an agreement when you have to, but your general attitude is, I'm walking away. And that has a very negative effect on other countries.
How will 9/11 affect where we are and what we have to do in the world?
Well, I think there's several effects. One is, of course, it's forced this administration to rethink how it relates to other countries and the coalitions, et cetera, but still only in a relatively limited way. On the other hand, it has, I think, awakened the American public to the interdependence that we have with the rest of the world in a very stark and unfortunately tragic way, but that we are linked through things we don't fully understand. And that's why people say, well, why do they hate us? Americans have an image, a very positive image of the United States. So it comes as a shock that people could hate us that much. And that opens the door to a tremendous dialogue about how we play our role in the world and how we're linked to the world in a variety of ways. That's the opportunity. That's the terrific opportunity. The media, right after 9/11, actually did a lot of this because they had to go 24 hours a day and they didn't have any commercials and they were just going into every aspect of it. But they've retreated from that. It's very much on the war. But I find, and I'd be interested in your own experience here on the campus, but I find when I go out on speaking that people are very interested in these questions. They want to know and want to know. And then there's a poll that's out that shows that by a very large majority, Americans know that the war on terrorism is not going to be met by military means alone, that we've got to be dealing with these other global issues. So that's an opportunity. The question is whether it's seized.
There's a curious thing here, which is this American withdrawal, this emphasis on unilateralism, comes at a time when our educational system is producing so many young people who have been exposed to diversity, to different cultures, who are very informed in a way through the culture about the complexity of the world and so on. But on the other hand, one has this this unilateralism emanating from both the state in its diplomacy, but also in the dynamic of domestic politics, where unilateralism, American first, prevails.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is and again, it's a question of leadership and articulation, and that's not only from the government but from the media and elsewhere. What does it mean to be the only superpower in a world that is so complex and interdependent? How do you define that role? You're the biggest guy on the block, but you also need everybody else on it. That takes a lot of articulation. And people who say, because you're the biggest guy on the block, you can get whatever you want, that's kind of self-satisfying. You know, you don't have to worry about it so much. Whereas I think if people talk more about what it takes, and it's complex, one would get a good response. But there is also something about globalization, just to go back to that for a moment. There's an interesting approach that James Rosno takes on this, that globalization produces a great deal of integration, but because it also produces a great deal of anxiety, there's fragmentation at the same side. At the same time, people pull back. And so you see more emphasis on ethnic identity, or on local government, or on communities. It's a way of sort of, gee, I'm losing myself in this. And I think we see that tension too. Yes, we know now we're more connected with the world, but let's do something in our own community. I feel comfortable there. And one has to deal with the tendencies in both directions.
And of course, in this globalized age, there's still work for diplomacy. And I'm curious, your background as ambassador to Nigeria and South Africa, both places where the work of democratization was very important, and presumably our foreign policy could help in that regard. How should we be continuing those kind of efforts?
Well, I found the South African experience extremely rewarding because when we got there in 1992, a lot of the issues that had divided the United States over South Africa were behind us. So we were very much in favor of the transition. And we were able to bring a lot of diplomatic and expertise and other things, other resources to bear, putting money into civil society, conflict resolution. The negotiations were in the hands of the South Africans, which was right and proper. But we could bring an awful lot of support to bear for the process and play a role that I feel was significant. I think that's still the case in countries like Nigeria or in countries like Argentina, et cetera, where if we bring the resources to bear, and they're diplomatic, they're skilled, and as well as financial, the United States can play a very positive role. But we allowed the diplomatic resource to decline tremendously in the 1990s. Colin Powell, to his credit, is working very hard to restore them. We've allowed our foreign aid program to decline, so the amount of resources we've got to work with are more limited. And we lose opportunities. I mean, it's the capability of the United States, because we have a lot of very good people in the country you can bring to bear on issues. We lose opportunities as a result.
So looking out ahead to the future, how would you advise students to prepare for the future?
Well, I think students should prepare in two ways. I think the opportunity when you're in a campus situation to explore global issues and other cultures, but understand some of the complexities of the interdependence, because some of it's highly technical, and you can only get it in a classroom. But then to think of their careers in global terms, to think of, people say that now when a student graduates from college, they can expect to make 5 different career choices in the course of their lives, which is different than when I came out of college. Think globally. Think of where you can play a role on a humanitarian basis or in commerce or in other places that will contribute to what I like to call making it a better and a safer world. That is, a world that works better. And one can do that through commerce, one can do it through NGOs, one can do it through public service. But think in those terms.
I'm curious, in your background, I sense, I read an emphasis on humanitarian concerns, aid, refugees, and so on. What in your background pointed you in that direction? It wasn't learning political science at Harvard What was it?
Well, it's a good question. I suppose a number of things. I suppose the outlook of the way my parents thought about the world and their coming out of Europe and their reaction to what happened in Europe during World War II. We also, our store was in an African-American neighborhood, and I had a great sense of the problems of discrimination and poverty growing up. But also the fact that although I intended originally to start in the State Department, instead, for reasons of wanting to work on Asia, went to the Foreign Aid Program, was very helpful. And I'm very glad, because I spent the first 20 years of my career working on problems of poverty and development. And I'm glad of that, because I think it's something concrete and very important. And when I did move to the State Department, I retained that interest and the importance of it for the United States.
So if students watch this tape and your very interesting odyssey, what do you think is a good lesson for them to learn about your journey from political science to government to diplomacy and now into the nonprofit advocacy sector?
There are different roles played by different organizations in different parts of our society, and all of them have an important role. The advocacy organizations and the governments that have to listen but not necessarily accept everything but do something, and the humanitarian agencies and the disarmament agencies and the Defense Department. Wherever you are, you do the very best job you can do. And, you know, a lot of people rise through the government with, you know, using elbows and a lot of hard things. I did find, and it's one of the things that was gratifying in the U.S. government, if you came to the table at whatever meeting with the best ideas, you often found responsibility gravitated to you. And that was very, very gratifying in the U.S. government. So I would say to students, whichever direction you go, there's a potential for making that contribution. Just bring your best ideas. Don't be afraid to do that to the table.
One final question. What, through the work of your project and the insights that you're bringing, what one change would you like to see in the way that America conducts its business abroad?
I think the one thing is to always keep in mind the values that make the public supportive of what we are going to be doing. And yet that doesn't mean we're saints, and it doesn't mean we never do things that are more in our interest in some way. But if you bring to bear those values and therefore you balance what you're doing, if you have to do terrorism, you're not insensitive to poverty and inequality. If you're going to push for free trade, you've got to recognize that it's got to be more equitable. And if we keep that at the forefront, I think we'll have a foreign policy to get strong support, but I also think it'll work better.
Ambassador Lyman, on that note, we want to thank you very much for coming here today, talking to us about your life and your work.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.